We're all aware that technology shapes our world, but when we talk about the climate crisis, when we talk about the environment, does technology represent a path to salvation, or is it actually a core part of the problem? The scholar of media, Neil Postman, would say that if in fact technology is part of the problem, we certainly could not rely on it to be the solution. It would be awkward to be relying on the very thing that's causing the problem. But perhaps Postman is mistaken here. Perhaps technology is in some ways degrading our environment, and yet also technology used in the right way might also be a possible source of remediation for the environment. And so, to discuss this issue, I want to look at two nonfiction sources. One source is chapter 3 of Benedetta Brevini's book, Is AI Good for the Planet? And the other source is chapter 1 of Emma Marris's book called The Rambunctious Garden. Both of them are deeply interested in technology and ecology, study of the environment. I think they probably would both agree that we're in something of an ecological crisis. But where they differ, I think, and I think you'll see this as we start to discuss them in some more detail, is the way we should confront this problem and the way we should uh, hope to fix it. I think they're going to come at this from very different ways. Um, and you're going to see me occasionally throughout the video looking off and looking down. And it's because I'm reading from a paper that I've been working on, sort of talking about the two of them. And then I hope in our discussion we could also weave in maybe a little bit of Wally, the movie, to help us frame some of this. So on the one side of the issue, you have Brevini, and she is fiercely critical that artificial intelligence and data capitalism is actively contributing to our climate crisis. And from her point of view, it demands a radical slowdown or halt. And when she refers to data capitalism, she's talking specifically about the kind of online capitalism where data is the source of monetization. Think of all those free apps that you use where you're not paying for them, but as some have often said, if you're not paying for the app, then you are the product. The product is you. So your data is being sold to some third party, and that is how that app manufacturer is making money. And so when Breveni is talking about artificial intelligence and data capitalism driving the ecological crisis, this is the kind of capitalism she's talking about. Capitalism where data is the prime commodity. And then on the other hand, you have Emma Marris, and what she's going to argue is that a lot of ecologists, a lot of conservationists are misguided in their hopes of helping the climate crisis because she thinks many of them are driven by what she calls a dream of pristine wilderness. Uh, what she means by that is that many conservationists have this ideal in mind of the environment where there is no human footprint, and that the environment is entirely wild and and unaffected by humanity. And she thinks if this is our goal, if this is our model for ecology, then we're doomed to fail from the very beginning. And so what she's gonna argue is that this idea of a pristine wilderness is already a dead idea, and that what we have to hope for is to embrace technology and human management of the environment and start thinking of the environment in a different way. Okay. And then we'll look at both of them in some detail. So I want to put these two different points of view, one that's focused on stopping or slowing technological expansion, and the other about managing the altered landscape technologically. I want to put these two into conversation. So let's start with Benedetta Brevini, who's a political theorist. And in her book, in chapter 3 of the book, the excerpt that I gave for you, um, the chapter of the book is called of book is called Why AI Worsens the Climate Crisis. This is her chapter. And she says her perspective in this chapter identifies contemporary technology, in particular AI. It's not as a potential solution in the way that maybe someone like Emma Marris might, but she sees it as a central cause of environmental damage. And she points to a number of reasons why artificial intelligence is a driving force behind the ecological crisis. She says the following: artificial intelligence continuously increases our energy consumption to sustain its computational power needed for training algorithms and making sense of massive amounts of data. This pushes cloud and server farms to their limits, demanding more electricity and water for their cooling systems. So, if you think about why this is the case, if we are referring to data capitalism, that is relying on data as its source of income and of monetization, these companies are more and more data. I mean, more data the better, right? And so, I mean, there's even a branch of uh, in the tech world now called big data, which is all about sort of managing massive amounts of data. And so, if data is king here and is the economic model, it seems, or at least to Brevini, it seems that there's just going to be a push to store more and more data and to keep harvesting more and more data. And so she sees no end in sight to the expansion of data centers, to the need for cooling systems. And so she says, she points to the AI scholar and former computer scientist at Google, Timnit Gebru. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. But Gebru co-authored a paper that raised major issues, and she was, I think, fired from Google, perhaps because of the paper. The paper raised major concerns about how AI models have become unwieldy and too data intensive. Her paper was one of the few to shed light on the massive quote unquote environmental costs of AI. And just anecdotally, I've spoken to a couple of computer scientists. I was on a podcast with one a couple months ago, and he said there's when it comes to, at least with large language models, there's a certain amount of error we're going to have to just be tolerant of, because in order to fix that last 10% of error that we see in large language models, it's going to require just exponential amounts of energy, and even amounts of energy that are just unfathomable with the natural resources we have on Earth. I mean, so this is a direct refutation, or at least a direct challenge to someone like Ray Kurzweil, who thinks we can just continue increasing our technological output exponentially. Someone like that computer scientist I spoke to, and someone like Timnit Gebru from the Brevini source, she would say there's a very real limitation we're going to hit into, which is there are only so many resources we're going to be able to strip from the environment before we really start to degrade things. So the costs are staggering. Brevini, throughout her chapter, she gave, I thought, a really interesting statistic, which talks about how much energy is consumed with your just ordinary large language model. And she said that a study that she quoted, and I believe it was a study by University of Massachusetts Amherst. Yeah, University of Massachusetts Amherst did a study, and the study made, and I'm reading it to you here. The study was conducted by Emma Struble and her collaborators, and the study made an unequivocal damning finding. A common AI training model in linguistics can emit more than 284 tons of carbon dioxide, and this is equivalent to 5 times the lifetime emissions of the average American car. Considering, I'm just continuing to read from Brevini here. Considering that a flight between London and Rome emits roughly 234 kilograms of CO2, and a return flight between London and New York City emits roughly 986 kilograms of CO2, the carbon emissions of this type of AI are roughly comparable, listen to this, to 288 return flights from London to New York City, or 1,213 return flights from London to Rome. So a ton of emissions, and that is just to train. That's just to train a large language model. That's not to run it. That's not to do anything else. That's just the training of it to get it sort of to the point where it can run. Um, this expansion has drastically accelerated the consumption of raw materials, Brevini says, and energy. And she says she says it's also what, so in one sense it's expanded our use of natural resources and energy. And she says it also uses the use of AI has also boosted what she calls uber consumerism, intensifying the environmental costs through what she calls, quote, the proliferation of unnecessary products that generate waste in packaging and obsolescence. So all the things that are just that we unnecessary products that we buy and that are sort of their wasteful packaging. So that's also a byproduct of this data capitalism that she's talking about. I mean, I could just anecdotally, I could also think of like when I'll be on a social media platform and I'll just sort of run across ads, and now all of a sudden I have to buy some. I have this desire to buy something that 10 minutes ago I didn't even cross my mind to buy. And so I think when she's talking about uber consumerism, this is what she's talking about. And so to sum up her critique from her point of view, modern technology is the engine of acceleration, and the solution is urgent action to radically alter the way we power and use the tech industry. It's going to require a radical just change in the way we're doing things. For her, it's going to be a lot of renewable energy, etc. And I'll talk a little bit more about the renewable energy in a little bit. But she thinks the modern tech industry is a huge problem when it comes to the climate crisis. So how is Emma Marris different? Let's shift focus and let's talk about Emma Marris, who is a nature writer. She's not coming at this from a political theory or economic perspective. She's looking at this really from the perspective of, I would say, more philosophical and more along the lines of just writing about nature. And so the kind of evidence that she's going to use is much more sitting down and talking to actual conservationists, talking to people on the ground, trying to do environmental restorations, etc. Whereas Brevini is looking at hard data studies, things like that. Marris is much more looking at experiential evidence here of just what she's seeing on the ground. And I would say the thesis for her book, The Rambunctious Garden, is that she wants us to change the way we think about nature and accept this idea that nature is not pristine. Let me say that again. Nature is not pristine. She uses that phrase a couple of times in the chapter that I gave you in chapter 1 of the book, that nature is not pristine. What does she mean by that? Well, the title, The Rambunctious Garden, what she wants us to think about and what she wants us to shift our perspective, how she wants us to shift our perspective, is that we need to think of the environment less as pristine, untouched, no human footprint, and we need to think of it more as a rambunctious garden. That is rambunctious and wild, but also something that is tended and managed and under the care and supervision of people. In some ways, I mean, if we think back to the Wally video that I made for you, that it's kind of this Eden concept from the Old Testament, which is that humans are the stewards of nature. The language that's used in Genesis in the Bible is we have dominion over nature, but that word dominion, it's much better translated that we have stewardship and care over nature. And so Marris has a similar, I think, thesis in her book, which is that we have to stop thinking of nature as that which is separate from human hands and human intervention, and think of it more as something that is cultivated by people. And because from her point of view, we're not going to be able to restore nature back to the point where a pre-human time. That she just thinks that's not realistic. And so in her book, in chapter 1 of her book, she starts off, and I really love the way she starts off this chapter. She says we've lost nature, which is a kind of a mysterious way of describing things. But she says we've lost nature in the sense that much nature has been destroyed. Much of nature has been destroyed. So she does agree with Benedetta Brevini that there is an ecological crisis. She's not denying that. She's not in denial about the impact we're having on the environment. But she also says the following, which I really like. She says we've also lost nature in a second sense. She says, we've also lost nature in another sense. She says we've misplaced it. We have hidden nature from ourselves. She says our mistake, continuing on here, our mistake has been thinking that nature is something out there, far away. We watch it on TV, we read about it in glossy magazines, we imagine a place somewhere distant, wild and free, a place with no people and no roads and no fences, no power lines, untouched by humanity's great grubby hands, unchanging except for the season's turn. This dream of pristine wilderness haunts us. It blinds us. And so what she wants to say is, like, actually nature's everywhere. Nature's everywhere. Learning to see that the creek behind a parking lot, that's nature. It's we need to get rid of this idea that nature is something apart from humanity. Humans are, for her, stewards of the earth. And she says the following, continuing on page 2 or 3, I think, in the same chapter. She says, and she's talking about humans here, we are already running the whole earth. Whether we admit it or not, to run it consciously and effectively, we must admit our role and even embrace it. We must temper or cut back our romantic notion of untrammeled wilderness and find room next to it for the more nuanced notion of a global, half-wild, rambunctious garden tended by us. So we have to get rid of this romantic idea of wilderness that is untouched by human hands. So I've often found myself saying things like, oh, there are parts of Alaska that I want to go to because they're still sort of wild and untouched by people. And so Marris here is kind of calling people like me out, where she's saying, like, this isn't the only thing that's nature. There's nature everywhere. Like, your backyard is nature. The sidewalk where there's grass growing, that's nature too. Looking around and having a different set of eyes is what she's challenging us here. Because human influence is global and irreversible, we can't rely on, Marris says, we can't rely on this historical baseline going back to some point in the past, some 0 point where there's no negative change, and trying to work our way back to that. She says there's no way we could do that. I mean, she gives this great example in chapter 1 where she says, if you just breathe in now, you are breathing in 36% more carbon dioxide than you would have in 1750. And so there's no way, just because of all the new technology we have on Earth, there is no way of going back to a pre-1750 environment. It would require so much radical change to the planet that and she's going to say there's even a paradox there that I want to hold off on for just a second. So she's saying there's no way we could go back to that. And so what we have to instead work with is, how can we take our environment, which now has 36% more carbon dioxide, and forge a new kind of ecology that accepts that as a given, takes that as a given, and aims for sustainability in that regard, looking to the future rather than trying to remediate and work backward and strip things away to get to the past. She says this is impossible and futile. And not to mention it, I mean, one critique we might make of people who are particularly on the anti-technology side. If I had to group the two of these thinkers, I mean, I don't think Benedetta Brevini is anti-technology, but she's maybe more skeptical of technology than Emma Marris is. But I think someone like Emma Marris might say, this idea of going back to or curbing technological advancement as a way of trying to solve the ecological crisis, um, is a kind of nostalgia that we're looking to some golden age in the past that is unattainable and will only frustrate us if we are trying to work backward toward that. And that's a similar criticism we might level at people who are really, really, really critical of technology. And and what we might say is like people who are afraid of technological change, are is there some like nostalgia for the past that they are yearning for, that Maris would say is futile to try to go back to. So similarly, the I think some or Maris would say some conservationists and some environmentalists have this same sort of nostalgia bias for trying to go back to a better time in the past. So she says trying to restore an ecosystem to a specific date in the past requires an immense, expensive, and difficult human intervention. And it often involves just destroying natural environments, ripping out existing vegetation, and eliminating so-called invasive species. She talks in this first chapter of her book about a sanctuary in Melbourne, Australia, called the Scotia Sanctuary, and I believe it's still there. And what this Scotia Sanctuary is a government-funded sanctuary that, as far as I know, it's the biggest nature sanctuary in on the continent there. And what they have, what she describes in the book is that some of the creatures um, that were initially there pre European contact, yeah, pre 1770. Um, I mean, Australia is a very isolated continent, and so a lot of the creatures that evolved to live there did not have any outside competition from anywhere because it's a very isolated place. Similar with Hawaii, which she also talks about, also very isolated. So there, the species, the durability is very limited. And so when you had Europeans come in and introduce foxes and other things for hunting, it just ravaged the indigenous animal population there. And so this Scotia sanctuary to remediate this would, and describes this one guy basically like, going on a hunting spree, killing foxes, trapping rabbits, poisoning rabbits, in order to section off parts of Australia so that this indigenous this indigenous these indigenous species could survive. Required killing massive amounts of animals that were already there, and plant species that were already there. And so Brevini really points to this, and sorry, not Brevini, Maris points to this, I think, really interesting paradox, and maybe we could label it the Maris paradox, because I think it's something that's really, really gets to the core of the fallacy at the heart of a lot of environmentalism. She says this. She says, holding small areas like Scotia, the one that I talked about in Australia, holding small areas like that to states that resemble historical baselines in the past, like I said, pre 1770, may be possible, she says, depending on where the area is and what date one would like to return to. And here's the paradox, though. But to do it will take human intervention, both in the beginning and indefinitely into the future. A historically faithful ecosystem is necessarily a heavily managed ecosystem. It is not quite the pristine wilderness many nature lovers look to as the ideal. And there's the paradox that unravels the idea of pristine wilderness, she says. If we define wild as unmanaged, then the ecosystems that look the most pristine are perhaps the most likely, or the least likely, sorry, to be truly wild. Let me read that again. If we define wild as unmanaged, then the ecosystems that look the most pristine are perhaps the least likely to be truly wild. So what she's saying there is, if we're going to hope, if we're our hope as environmentalists is to go back to some previous time where the human footprint was smaller and smaller, then because of where we're at now, presently, that's going to require massive amounts of human intervention to start that project and to maintain that project. She talks about the Scotia Sanctuary in chapter 1, and not only does the Scotia Sanctuary require fencing everywhere, but it requires up-to-date technology to monitor things, to track the animals as they're going around the area. If even a single fox got in there, it would ravage the population again. So it requires constant upkeep by people and the most up-to-date technology that we have. And so that's what we mean by the Marris paradox. If we want to have this kind of Eden-like paradise, which, like I said, it's not even an Eden paradise, but like an untouched, a nostalgic yearning for the way things were in nature before, it's going to require massive amounts of human intervention and technology. And so what does that mean? It's going to mean we're going to need to use more and more of modern technology, and it means we're going to have more and more of a say in nature. We're going to need to be more and more stewards over the earth, more and more monitoring everything. It's not going to be a hands-off approach because it's not the landscape won't survive that way, she says. Okay, so how does Wally fit into this? Let's talk about Wally for a bit. I think Wally in some ways embodies both Brevini and Marris. How so? Well, on the one hand, the movie is a perfect summary of Brevini's AI critique. So in the movie, we see that the Earth is completely ruined. It's buried under mountains of garbage when the movie begins. And this aligns perfectly with Brevini's warning about global tech driving uber consumerism, right? When you look at a lot of the garbage that's sort of littering the earth in at the beginning of Wally, it's very kind of frivolous, sort of useless stuff. And so Brevini goes on that these global tech organizations, like by and large in the movie, they function as digital lords, she says, who generate waste and drive up the costs of disposing of toxic and digital e-waste. And in the movie, you basically have a single global, I guess you could even call them a tech giant in the movie, and they've essentially made the planet uninhabitable. They've given people everything that they want, but really their true needs as humans have been very much absent. And the humans and just the ordinary everyday human, they're not in control. They're floating in space somewhere, right? They're totally dependent on the axiom to take care of them in every way. Right? Their agency and their ability to think on their own, to be independent, is largely removed from them. And so this single company, through its desire to produce more and keep generating new needs and satisfying them, has stripped the planet, right? Has made it uninhabitable. And so this illustrates what Brevini is talking about when she says that, where she says the gatekeepers, those in control and development of AI, exert immense ideological, economic, and political power. Let me read that again. The gatekeepers, those who control development in AI, exert immense ideological, economic, and political power. And so think about the corporation by and large in the movie. It's very clear that not only are they the ideological gatekeeper, they very much control the way people think about the world. right? When you get to the axiom in the movie, um, everyone's dressing the same. They kind of, they're all interfacing and communicating in very much the same way. They're kind of indistinguishable even as people, right? Um, and they absolutely dictate policy by and large. Remember, we talked in our Wally video about how the CEO of the company, in a way, resembles a president or a political leader. And so the movie definitely takes to heart Brevini's critique of massive a massive global corporation that's just sort of stripping the earth. And yet, on the other hand, at the end of the movie, and particularly in the credits, um, the movie speaks to what Marris says in her book. Because when the humans return to the earth, they don't land on a pristine and beautiful earth. They land on a completely ravaged planet. And there's the one struggling plant that's surviving, right? Um, and it's the symbol and the plant in the shoe, right? There's some beautiful symbolism there of a plant, but also in this human, this piece of nature that's tangled up with the human, which is shown in the symbol of the boot, right? A human footwear. Um, so this symbol of the boot of the plant in the boot shows the what Marris refers to as a global half-wild rambunctious garden. It's nature, but it's nature that is tended to and taken care of by people. That's what Wally is. That's what Wally's about at the end there. It's about nature, but it's about nature in the hands of people. So the planet is not waiting to be admired, it is waiting to be tended to by us. Okay? The humans begin a new life on Earth, planting and weeding and managing this new ecosystem. They're they don't they don't work backward towards some vision of the past. They work with they work with the present reality on Earth at the time, which is a very ravaged planet. And as Marris would say, they're layering goals and managing landscapes with an eye to the future rather than the past. And we see in that credit sequence at the end, the robots are working alongside them to tend this new Earth. Right? Okay, so I think Wally clarifies the subtle differences found in both of the sources. Brevini wants us to fight the corporate power structures behind technology that are preventing that are accelerating harm rather. Whereas someone like Marris, her critique is much more it's not so much directed at big corporations, and it's really pointing to the flaws on the side of conservationists. So I think Marris is probably maybe more optimistic about um, perhaps relying on corporations and technology as a way of possibly uh, creating a new, I don't want to say new environment, but moving the environment into toward the future rather than trying to recreate some past version of the environment that we're just not going to be able to get back to. Um, and so to just sum up here, and we'll wrap up. One source views technology as the engine of accelerating consumption. That's Brevini, and the other sees the world as irrevocably altered. That's Marris, saying we've already changed the Earth so much. Our humans are already, as she said, have our hands in everything, and so the best we can hope for, if we're Marris, is to come up with what she calls a smorgasbord of alternative goals. And that might mean that we have fenced in reserves to help certain species stay around. That might mean managing carbon capture. But it might also mean for Marris that we are not so wed to the idea of these were native trees. We can only have native trees. Like for example, in Hawaii, um, a lot of the she talks about um, a lot of the areas that are the fenced in reserves are relying on non-native trees to capture some of the carbon. And this is beneficial for the environment, but it also means that we're introducing invasive species, right? And so we might, for Marris, we might have to compromise and have this sort of hybrid environment. Okay, um, I'll just wrap up here. Brevini's AI critique warns us that the path of technological expansion leads directly to a planetary garbage heap, which we see at the beginning of Wall-E. Um, and Brevini demands that we address what she calls the immense ideological, economic, and political power of the tech gatekeepers. We need to manage that. We need to have them cut back their use of energy, require more more renewable use of renewable sources from them. But Marris's approach, as I said, she's looking to not undoing the change that we've made with all of our technology to go back to some pre-1770 or some pre-human time in the past, but that we need to be proactive managers of the environment going forward. A successful ecological future, like the one we see at the end of Wall-E, has to draw on insights from both Brevini and Marris. A radical and immediate check, critique, curbing of the computational engines, the computers that are driving consumption and inequality, combined with a future-focused ecology that manages the Earth much more like what Marris calls a rambunctious garden, one where we humans are bringing our values to bear on the environment, and we are conscious stewards of the environment, managing it. I don't want to say micromanaging it, but managing it. Um, and that might mean also for Marris that we're bringing our most advanced technology to this cause of stewardship.